The government's handling of the 2020 grooming gang investigation exemplifies a troubling pattern, an endless cycle of inquiries, consultations, and promises that fail to deliver substantial change. And Professor Alexis Jay's authoritative 2022 report was crystal clear. We don't need more investigations. What we need is action. Yet, like the tragedies of Grenfell, the contaminated blood scandal, the Horizon post office scandal, countless other government commitments like paying Andrew Malkinson for being imprisoned for so long, the gap between reality and rhetoric yawns wide. And the recommendations from Jay's report, a blueprint, if you will, for safeguarding children and supporting survivors, has 20 proposals that were statutory requirements for mandatory reporting of child abuse and a national redress scheme for victims and the creation of a child protection authority with comprehensive inspection powers. Bold, necessary measures, yet years later, many of these measures remain completely untouched. Take, for example, the 3-year cap on personal injury claims for child abuse victims. The Jay report urged its removal, yet the law remains unchanged. The same can be said of therapeutic support for survivors, a national financial redress scheme, extending the barring of certain individuals from working with children to overseas jurisdictions. Promises of consultations have borne no fruit. Responsibility for children has not even been elevated to cabinet level. Instead, we've seen distraction after distraction, and the current Conservative brouhaha from Robert Jenrick and now Kemi Badenoch is simply a distraction in another form. They have spent their political capital on a divisive debate, on culture wars and performative outrage, rather than addressing these glaring deficiencies. Their priorities are not those of the victims, whose suffering is compounded by this government and the previous government's failure to act. Their priorities are themselves. Braverman is out for herself. Jenrick is out for himself. Yet there have been partial steps. The Online Safety Act, finally enacted, mandates age verification for social media platforms. Don't see how it can be enforced, but there it is. It falls short of requiring pre-screening for children's images, a critical measure that Jay explicitly calls for. Similarly, the forthcoming Crime and Policing Bill proposes criminal sanctions for failure to report abuse, a key recommendation. But where is the urgency? Legislation has languished, delayed further by political turmoil and election cycles, the obsession with election, whether internally or externally, whether internally in the party or through a general election, waiting for the next general election. There's actually work to be done. And if the government can't do it, then the opposition should be holding it to account. Neither is functioning because both are too self-obsessed. We need to acknowledge the impact of all this on victims, and survivors are not asking for yet another inquiry. They need closure and tangible support, not another inquiry, not another talking shop. The conviction rates, as seen through Operation Stovewood, are laudable. Over 39 individuals convicted and sentenced to nearly 500 years collectively. That demonstrates some progress, but legal action is just one facet of the system, one facet of justice. Without real change, the risk of recurrence looms large, and Parliament now faces calls for another inquiry. Conservatives argue that Professor Jay's investigation covered only 6 towns, overlooking the breadth of the crisis. Yet, as Victims Minister Alex Davies-Jones points out, Jay's work is comprehensive. To reopen these wounds for political posturing is not just wasteful, it's cruel. And the government's refusal to act decisively reflects a further failure of government, one evident in their inability to deliver on the promises across numerous fronts. Whether it's Horizon or Grenfell, the pattern's clear. Grand promises, grand proclamations, followed by complete inertia. Victims of abuse cannot afford to be another casualty of this dismal cycle of ineptitude. Professor Jay made an urgent plea, and I think it's worth repeating. We've set out what action is required. People should just get on with it. Instead, there's lots of noise. The government must demonstrate that it's capable of doing something. And if it's going to be enabled in its dilatory indifference by the opposition, if that's the only thing the opposition is capable of doing, distracting, then the opposition isn't doing a decent job. The opposition needs to be replaced. Anything less than action is a betrayal not only of the victims of grooming gangs, but of our collective responsibility to protect the vulnerable.